If you found this video, I need you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Stop scrolling. Stop multitasking. Put down whatever is in your hands, because what I am about to tell you is something I have never told anyone outside of that room. Not the full story, not every detail, not the parts that still make my hands shake when I think about them, at 2 a.m, when the house is completely quiet, and the only sound is the wind against the windows of a home that suddenly feels both too large and too full of memories at the same time. My name is Stella. I am 58 years old. I live in Naperville, Illinois, in a 4-bedroom colonial house on a tree-lined street where the neighbors wave when they drive by, and the elementary school is 3 blocks away, and on summer evenings you can hear children laughing in backyards and sprinklers running, and it all looks so perfectly, heartbreakingly normal from the outside. I buried my husband on a Monday. Richard, 61 years old, 32 years of marriage, the man who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings without being asked, who remembered every anniversary, not just with a card, but with the exact flower I had carried in my wedding bouquet. White garden roses, he never once forgot. Who called me from business trips every single night at 9 o'clock, no matter what time zone he was in. Who held my hand through 2 difficult pregnancies and 1 miscarriage we never told anyone about, and the death of my father, and every hard thing life had thrown at us. Every single one. I buried him on a Monday in October, in the cemetery where his parents are buried, under a gray Illinois sky that felt appropriately solemn, appropriately heavy, as though the weather itself understood what the day required. My children were there, of course. Brandon, 34, Melissa, 31. They stood on either side of me at the graveside, and Brandon put his arm around my shoulders at one point, and I leaned into him because he is tall, like his father was tall. And in that moment, I needed to believe that I was not entirely alone in the world, that the people I had built my life around would hold me up through this, the way Richard had always held me up, the way I had always held them up when they were small and the world was frightening. I believed that, standing at Richard's grave. I genuinely believed it. I want you to remember that, because everything I'm about to tell you needs to be understood in the context of that belief, the absolute, bone-deep conviction that my children, who I had nursed and raised and driven to soccer practice, and helped with homework and cried over at graduations, and worried about through every difficult season of their young adult lives, that these 2 people loved me, that they would be there for me, that we would grieve together and figure out the future together, and that whatever Richard had left behind, we would navigate it as a family, the way he would have wanted. I want you to hold on to that image of me at the graveside, trusting, leaning on my son's arm, believing, because 4 days later on my birthday, I sat in this house completely alone. Not one phone call, not one text message, not a single happy birthday, Mom. Nothing. I had turned 58 years old, and the 2 people I had sacrificed the most for, the 2 people who existed in this world because of the love I had shared with the man we had just buried, could not find 60 seconds in their day to acknowledge that I was alive and that I was their mother, and that it was my birthday, and I was sitting in a house full of Richard's things, and Richard's smell and Richard's absence, completely, utterly alone. I sat at the kitchen table where we had eaten 10,000 family dinners. I looked at the chair where Richard always sat, at the coffee mug with the chipped handle that I had kept meaning to throw away, and never did because he liked it, because he said it fit perfectly in his hand. I looked at his chair and his mug, and the window where the afternoon light came in, at the angle he always said was perfect for reading, and I breathed through it. I breathed through all of it. 7 o'clock in the evening, the doorbell rang. I thought, and I am telling you this because I need you to understand how completely unprepared I was. I thought maybe they had surprised me. Maybe they had been planning something all day, and this was the moment. Maybe they were standing on my porch with a birthday cake and flowers and balloons. Maybe they felt terrible about the silence and wanted to make it right. Maybe I had been wrong to feel hurt and abandoned and forgotten. I walked to the door. I straightened my sweater. I took 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3. I opened the door. Brandon was standing there in his charcoal gray overcoat, the expensive one he bought last winter, and Melissa was just behind him in a camel-colored blazer with her hair pulled back in a way that made her look very professional and very deliberate. And neither of them said, "Happy birthday!" And neither of them was holding flowers or cake or anything, except a manila folder that Brandon was holding at his side, like a weapon he hadn't decided to draw yet. "Mom," Brandon said, "we need to talk." And before I could say a word, before I could even process what was happening, or find the right combination of feelings to put on my face, I heard the sound of the kitchen door opening behind me. The side door, the one that opens from the garage. And I heard my sister Carol's voice, clear and steady, and absolutely certain of itself, saying, "They came today, Stella. He was right about everything." I turned around. Carol was standing in the kitchen doorway with her laptop open in her arms, and the screen was facing Brandon and Melissa, and the file was already open. And before either of my children could take a single step forward, before Brandon could close that manila folder, or Melissa could reach for her phone, the recording started. I need you to pause here with me for 1 moment, because the next part of this story, the part that explains everything, the part that shows you who Richard truly was, and what he knew, and what he did about it, that part requires you to understand where we all started. It requires you to understand the whole story. If you're already feeling something watching this, if something in your chest is tight and you want to know what was on that recording, and what happened next, and how we got to this moment, then please, before we go any further, hit that like button for me. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this story is going to take us places I promise you are not expecting, and I want you with me for every single second of it. Drop something in the comments. Tell me if you've ever had someone in your family show you who they really were at the worst possible moment. Tell me if you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most. I'll be reading every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Let me tell you about Stella and Richard, about how we started and how 32 years of a life together led to a chipped coffee mug and an empty chair and a door opening on my birthday that changed everything. I grew up in Elmhurst, Illinois, about 20 minutes west of Chicago, in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on a block of modest 3-bedroom ranch houses where everybody knew everybody, and nobody had very much, and nobody seemed particularly bothered by that fact. My father, Gerald, was an electrician. My mother, Barbara, worked the front desk at a dental office for 30 years. They were not wealthy people, but they were people of extraordinary principle. People who said what they meant and meant what they said, who paid their bills on time and treated their neighbors with dignity, and went to church on Sundays not to be seen, but because they actually believed in something larger than themselves. I was the older of 2 daughters. Carol came along when I was 6, a dark-haired firecracker who from the age of about 3 seemed to understand exactly how the world worked, and had absolutely no patience for people who didn't. We were close in the way that sisters can be close when they share a bedroom for 18 years. Not always easy, not always comfortable, but fundamental. Carol was the person who knew me before I knew myself. I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign on a partial academic scholarship, studying business administration because my father said I had a head for numbers, and my mother said I should have something to fall back on. I was 20 years old when I walked into Introduction to Financial Accounting on a Tuesday morning in September and sat down in the second row, and the seat next to me was empty. And then a young man arrived approximately 4 minutes late and slid into it with the kind of quiet, unhurried confidence that suggested he was late by choice rather than by accident. Richard Caldwell. He was 22, finishing a business degree, working part-time at his uncle's insurance firm downtown. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and a watch that was clearly his father's, too large for his wrist, gold and slightly battered. And when he borrowed a pen from me that first day, because he had forgotten his own, he looked at me directly when he said thank you, the way some people never quite manage to do, the way that makes you feel actually seen, rather than simply looked at. We were together within 3 weeks. We were inseparable within 3 months. I brought him home for Thanksgiving that November, and my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen while he was talking football, with my father in the living room, and she said, "Stella, I like this one. He looks at you like you're the answer to something." And I knew exactly what she meant, because that is exactly how he looked at me. Like I had solved a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking. We graduated in the spring. Richard went to work for a mid-sized insurance firm in Chicago. I took a job in accounting at a manufacturing company in the western suburbs. We got engaged in the fall at a restaurant in the city, at a table by the window overlooking the river, and Richard had been so nervous that he dropped the ring box under the table and had to go under after it, and came up red-faced and laughing, and I was already crying by the time he actually said the words. Not because the proposal was perfect, it wasn't, but because it was so completely, absolutely him, and I loved him so entirely that his imperfections were indistinguishable from his charm. We were married the following June. Small wedding, just family and close friends, at a church in Elmhurst, with a reception at the Elks Lodge, where my parents were members. Richard's parents flew in from Indiana. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. Carol was my maid of honor, and somehow managed to give a toast that was both hilarious and genuinely moving, which is very Carol. We bought our house in Naperville in 1995, when Richard was doing well enough at the firm that we could afford a down payment, and it was a 4-bedroom colonial that needed work but had good bones, which is what the real estate agent said and what Richard said he could see, and what I, honestly, could not quite visualize, but trusted him on. We painted every room ourselves over 2 weekends. We refinished the hardwood floors. We planted a garden in the backyard that I always meant to be more serious about and never quite managed. Brandon was born in 1990, 2 years into our marriage, in the middle of a February snowstorm that shut down the highways and made Richard white-knuckled and sweating all the way to the hospital. He was a difficult baby, colicky, demanding, never a good sleeper, and I spent the first year of his life in a state of exhausted, bewildered devotion that I suspect is universal among new parents, but that felt, in the living of it, entirely unique to me. I loved him with a ferocity that frightened me sometimes, the way you can love something so much that the love itself becomes a kind of terror. Melissa came 4 years later, 1994, easier in every way that Brandon had been difficult. She slept, she ate, she smiled early, she was curious and delightful and easy to delight. Where Brandon had always seemed to be testing the boundaries of things, Melissa was content within them, or so it seemed. She was sweet-natured as a small child, imaginative and affectionate, The kind of little girl who brought you dandelions from the yard and acted as though she was presenting you with gold. I want to be careful here because I am not going to pretend that my children were always who they became. Children are not born the people they end up being. They are shaped by circumstances and choices and, yes, by their parents. And I have spent a great deal of time in the last year examining what I might have done differently, what seeds we might have planted without realizing it, what we might have said or failed to say that contributed to what came later. But I also know that at some point, adults make choices, and what my children chose, in the end, was theirs. Richard's career progressed steadily through the 90s and accelerated significantly in the early 2000s when he transitioned from the large firm to starting his own insurance consulting business, Caldwell Risk Solutions, which grew from 2 employees to 11 over the course of a decade, and which, by the time Richard was 50, was generating enough revenue that we were solidly, comfortably, undeniably upper middle class. Not wealthy, in the way that people with generational money are wealthy, not private jet wealthy, or second home in Aspen wealthy, but the kind of comfortable that means you don't worry about the electric bill, and you take a real vacation every year and both kids go to college without loans, and you have a financial advisor and a retirement account, and the house is paid off, and there is something in the investment portfolio that, when Richard talked about it, made him smile with quiet satisfaction. We were, in the simplest possible terms, secure. And that security was Richard's, his intelligence, his work ethic, his ability to build relationships and maintain them, his particular talent for understanding risk in ways that other people found either impossible or exhausting. I contributed. I had moved from accounting into financial consulting in the early 2000s and built a small but steady client base that I maintained even after the children were grown. But Richard was the engine. Richard was the foundation on which our particular version of the American dream had been carefully, patiently constructed. Those were good years, the ones in the middle. The children growing up, the house getting more comfortable as we renovated and updated it, vacations to Florida, and once to Italy for our 25th anniversary, Christmases that were full and warm and easy. Brandon played basketball in high school and was good enough to be proud of, but not good enough to pursue it seriously, which seemed fine, which seemed like the normal shape of a life. Melissa did theater and debate and had a large, rotating group of friends, and a laugh that could fill a room. I was happy. I want to say that clearly. I was genuinely, truly happy during those years, in the way that you sometimes only recognize in retrospect. That particular texture of contentment that you don't fully appreciate while you're in it because you're too busy living it. Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, and Richard in his reading chair, summer evenings on the back porch, the way the kitchen smelled at Thanksgiving. Richard's voice on the phone at 9 o'clock. I want you to hold that happiness. I want you to know it was real, because I need to tell you about the first crack, the one that appeared so gradually that I almost didn't see it, the one that Richard saw first and earlier, and more clearly than I did, because Richard was always better than I was at seeing things for what they actually were, rather than what he hoped they might be. Brandon graduated from the University of Illinois, the same school where his parents had met, a fact Richard was quietly proud of, with a degree in marketing in 2012. He came home that summer and spent 4 months, doing very little while Richard and I tried to be patient about it, tried to understand that the job market was difficult and that young people needed time to find their footing. Richard helped Brandon revise his resume. I forwarded him job listings. We covered his car insurance and his cell phone and his subscriptions and never said a word about it. In October, Brandon found a job at a marketing agency in the city. An entry-level position, not glamorous, but solid. A start. Richard and I took him to dinner to celebrate. We were genuinely thrilled. 6 months later, Brandon quit. There was an argument with a supervisor, he said. The culture was toxic, he said. He had a better opportunity in the pipeline, he said. The better opportunity in the pipeline took 11 months to materialize. During those 11 months, Richard quietly added money to Brandon's account every month, without telling me exactly how much, and I did not ask exactly how much, because I trusted Richard's judgment, and because I understood the instinct. He was our son. He was struggling. We could help. So we helped. The pattern, if I am being honest about it now, in a way I was not quite ready to be honest about it then, was that Brandon struggled, and we helped, and the struggling continued, and the helping continued, and there was always a reason and always an explanation, and always a next thing that was going to be the thing that turned it around. A new job that lasted 8 months. A business idea that needed startup capital. A relationship that ended badly that took 6 months of recovery. An apartment he could no longer afford after a roommate moved out suddenly. We helped. We always helped. Because that is what you do, isn't it? When your child is struggling, you help. Melissa was different in her approach, but the pattern underneath was the same. She was more subtle about it, more strategic. Melissa had always been better than Brandon at reading people, at understanding what they needed to hear. She graduated from DePaul in 2016 and moved into an apartment in Wicker Park with 2 friends and had a string of marketing and communications jobs that she held with more consistency than her brother, but which never quite seemed to lead anywhere. She called regularly. She came home for holidays. She was warm and engaged in a way that Brandon often wasn't. But there were things, small things that I filed away without quite examining them. The way she would ask about our finances. Not bluntly, never bluntly, but embedded in conversations about other things. Casual questions that seemed innocent in isolation, but formed a pattern when you lined them up. Dad's business is doing really well, right? Are you guys still working with the same financial advisor? Is the house fully paid off? I always answered openly because why wouldn't I? These were my children. These were questions a loving adult child might naturally ask. Richard noticed before I did. Richard was always a better observer of people than I was, and he had spent 30 years in the insurance business, which is fundamentally the business of anticipating risk, of understanding what people don't say as clearly as what they do say, of recognizing the shape of things before the shape becomes obvious. He mentioned it to me for the first time in the fall of 2019. We were at the kitchen table after dinner. The same table where I would sit alone 4 years later on my birthday. And he had his reading glasses on, and he was looking at something on his phone. And he set it down, and looked at me in a way I recognized as his serious face, his I need to say something face. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and I want you to listen to it as a piece of information before you respond emotionally. Because I think your first instinct is going to be to push back. I told him to go ahead. I think Brandon and Melissa are watching us, he said. Not in a caring way, in a calculating way. I think they are paying very close attention to what we have and what we've built, and I think their relationship with us, especially as we get older, is going to be significantly shaped by that. I pushed back, of course. I said he was being unfair, that they were our children, that of course they were interested in the family finances, in a broad sense because they were adults and it was natural. I said he was letting his professional habit of looking for risk color his personal relationships. I said that Melissa called us every week and that Brandon had been better lately. Richard listened to all of it. He did not argue. He just nodded and said, "Okay, maybe you're right." And then he picked up his phone and went back to whatever he had been reading. But he did not believe me, and I knew, somewhere beneath the pushback, beneath the instinct to defend my children, somewhere in the part of me that had been watching the same things he had been watching and had been choosing not to examine them too closely. I knew he wasn't wrong. I just wasn't ready yet to let him be right. The crack appeared, and I chose not to look at it, and life continued in the way that life does when you choose not to look at certain things. On the surface, normal. Family dinners and holiday gatherings and phone calls and the ordinary texture of relationships that seem fine because you have agreed, collectively and without ever saying so, not to examine them too carefully. And then Richard's heart started giving him trouble. It began with shortness of breath on the stairs, something he mentioned to me in late 2020 during the strange sealed-in months of the pandemic, when we were home all the time, and I noticed things I might otherwise have missed. I told him to call the doctor. He said he would. He didn't. Not for several weeks. And when he finally did and they ran the tests, and the cardiologist sat across from us and used words like coronary artery disease and significant blockage and "we need to discuss your options," I felt the bottom of my stomach drop in a way it had never dropped before. Not through 2 difficult pregnancies or a miscarriage or any of the hard things. This was different. This was Richard. This was the foundation. He had a procedure in January of 2021. It went well. He recovered. The cardiologist said he was doing well and gave him medication and a list of dietary changes and told him to walk every day and reduce stress, which Richard found both sensible and impossible, given the nature of running a business. But he tried. But something shifted in how he carried himself after that. Not dramatically, not visibly. To anyone who didn't know him as well as I did. He still went to work, still ran his business, still made dinner reservations on our anniversary, and took the car for oil changes without being reminded. But there was a quality of deliberateness to him that hadn't been there before. A quality of accounting for things, of making sure. He started having more detailed conversations with his attorney, James Whitaker, a man he had worked with for over a decade on business matters and who had become something of a friend over the years. He started asking me questions I hadn't expected, about which accounts I had access to, whether I knew where all the documents were, whether I was familiar with the investment portfolio in enough detail to manage it if I needed to. These were not conversations a dying man has, I told myself. These were conversations a practical man has when he has been reminded of his mortality. There is a difference, I told myself. I told myself a lot of things. The cardiologist visits continued. The numbers were not improving the way the doctor had hoped. In 2022, Richard had a second procedure, more involved than the first. He recovered again, slower this time, and there was a quality of effort to the recovery that frightened me, as though his body was working very hard to do something that once would have required no effort at all. It was during this recovery that the children's behavior shifted in a way I could no longer quite ignore. Brandon started calling more frequently. This should have been simply good news. My son, stepping up, being present. And I received it that way at first. He asked about Richard's condition with what seemed like genuine concern. He started dropping by the house more, sometimes unannounced, which he had never done before. He asked about Richard's business. Was it still running? Was there a plan if Richard couldn't work? Had we thought about what would happen with Caldwell Risk Solutions? These were questions that, in a different context, might have come from love, From the mature concern of a son watching his father age and wanting to be helpful, wanting to plan. But there was something in the asking, a quality of inventory, of assessment, that sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't quite name. Melissa came home for a weekend that fall. She was warm with Richard. She always was. She had always been a daddy's girl in the way that daughters sometimes are, and Richard adored her. But I found her in Richard's home office on the second morning, standing at his desk, looking at something on the surface of it. She said she had come up for a book she had left on a previous visit. There was no book on the desk. When I mentioned it to Richard later, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "I know." "What do you mean you know?" "I mean I'm aware," he said. "I've been aware for a while. It's why I've been talking to James." I sat down on the edge of the bed. "Richard, I don't want to frighten you," he said. "And I don't want to make accusations I can't support. But I want to make sure that whatever happens, if something happens, you are protected. That what we built is protected. And I want to make sure you understand something, Stella." He looked at me in that direct way of his, the way that meant he was saying something that needed to be heard clearly. "If I'm wrong, you will have done some extra paperwork and spent some time with an attorney, and nothing will have changed. If I'm right, you will have everything you need." I didn't sleep well that night. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about what he had said and felt the particular terror of understanding. Finally, something you have been half understanding for a long time. He was right. I knew he was right. I had known, in some buried place I hadn't let myself excavate, for longer than I was comfortable admitting. In the spring of 2023, Richard's heart failed. Not dramatically, not a heart attack in the street or a sudden collapse, but a steady, accelerating decline that the cardiologist had been warning us about, gently but consistently, for over a year. Richard spent 3 weeks in the hospital. He came home. He spent 2 weeks at home, in a hospital bed we had set up in the downstairs bedroom, because the stairs had become too difficult. And Carol came and stayed, and I did not sleep more than 4 hours on any given night. And Richard and I talked. Really talked. The way you talk, when you both understand that the conversation is running out. And he told me things. And I listened. And some of what he told me broke my heart into pieces that I am still, even now, still fitting back together. He died on a Monday morning in October, just as the light was coming through the bedroom window, in the way he had always loved. Brandon and Melissa came immediately. They were there for the death, there for the arrangements, there for the funeral. They stood beside me at the graveside, and I leaned on Brandon's arm, and I believed, in my broken and exhausted state, that they would be there for me in the way that people who love you are there for you. I want to tell you about the day after the funeral, because it is important for you to understand the speed of what happened. On Tuesday, the day after we buried Richard, Brandon called me, not to ask how I was, not to check on me. He called to ask about the will. He was careful about it. He was always careful, Brandon. He had learned over the years that directness with me produced friction, and he preferred a more circumspect approach, a way of getting to the thing he wanted by means of other things. He asked if I had spoken with James Whittaker. He asked when I was planning to be in contact with the attorney. He said, and I am quoting him as precisely as I can, because these words are burned into my memory. "I just want to make sure we have a clear picture of everything, Mom. For your sake as much as ours. It's important to know where things stand. For my sake as much as ours." I said I would be in touch with James when I was ready. On Wednesday, Melissa called. Her approach was different, softer, more emotional, wrapped in the language of grief. She said she was worried about me. She said she didn't want me to have to handle everything alone. She said that she and Brandon wanted to be helpful, wanted to take the administrative burden off my shoulders, that they could help me organize things and make sense of everything. Dad had so much going on with the business and the investments, she said. It would be really easy for things to get lost or complicated. We just want to help you navigate it. We just want to help you navigate it. I said I appreciated the offer. I said I would let her know. On Thursday, I did not hear from either of them. I moved through the house in a state that I can only describe as a controlled float, the particular kind of functional shock in which you do necessary things on automatic, while your mind is somewhere else entirely, somewhere quiet and still, and very close to the empty chair at the kitchen table. On Thursday night, I could not sleep. I lay in the bed that was too large now, in a room that was too quiet, and I thought about what Richard had said to me in the weeks before he died, about what he had told me and shown me and made sure I understood. On Friday, I woke up, and it was my birthday. I am going to be very honest with you about what that morning felt like. I want you to understand it. Not because I want your pity. I have never wanted anyone's pity. But because I think it is important for you to feel the full weight of what was happening to me, the full dimensions of the landscape in which I was living, so that what comes next means what it ought to mean. I made coffee. I made it the way I always make it, 2 cups at a time in the small drip machine that Richard always said was inferior to a French press, and that I preferred because it was simpler and faster. And I poured a cup and I carried it to the kitchen table, and I sat in my chair. Not Richard's chair. I could not sit in Richard's chair. And I looked at the morning light on the kitchen floor and I thought, it is my birthday, 58 years old. October. The maples in the backyard that Richard had planted with Brandon when Brandon was 6 were brilliant orange outside the window. The coffee was hot and good. The house was absolutely silent. My phone did not ring. No text messages arrived. The morning passed. I cleaned the kitchen and did a load of laundry and sat in the living room with a book I could not concentrate on, and watched 2 hours of the afternoon slide by. I thought about calling Carol. Carol never forgets my birthday. Carol has not missed a single birthday in 52 years. But Carol had called the night before, a long and loving call, and I knew she would call again today, and I told myself I would hear from the children first. I did not hear from the children. By 4 o'clock, I understood that I was not going to hear from them, and the understanding settled over me with a clarity that was almost calm. Almost, but not quite, because underneath the clarity was something enormous and cold and too large to look at directly, which was the full understanding of what it meant that my husband was dead, and my children had forgotten my birthday, 5 days after his funeral. Carol called at 5. She said happy birthday. She said she loved me. She said she was thinking about me every minute. Her voice was careful in a way I noticed but didn't remark on. She asked if I had heard from the kids. I said no. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet I heard something. A quality of confirmation, as though something she had expected to happen had happened. Stay close to the phone tonight, she said. Why? I asked. Just trust me, Stella. Stay close to the phone. I asked her what was going on. She said she would explain later, that she needed to make some calls first, that there were a few things she needed to arrange, and that she loved me, and she would see me soon. Then she said, Richard knew, honey. He knew everything. She hung up. I sat with those words in the quiet of my house for 2 hours. Richard knew. He knew everything. I turned them over and looked at them from different angles, and with every minute that passed, I felt something shifting inside me. Not grief, not exactly. Or not only grief, but something that lived alongside the grief and had been gathering in me since Tuesday, since Brandon's call about the will, since Melissa's offer to help me navigate, since every small and large thing I had been half-seeing for longer than I had admitted. Richard had told me, in the weeks before he died, that he had made arrangements, that he had worked with James Whittaker on some things, that I should not worry, that I would be taken care of, that he had thought carefully about what protection looked like, and had made sure it was in place. I had heard this, and held it, and not pressed for details because he was dying, and I could not bear to spend our remaining conversations on logistics, on paperwork, on the business of death. I wanted to be present with him. I wanted to hold his hand. I understood now that the details mattered. I understood that whatever Richard had arranged was about to become very relevant. At 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I have described what I saw when I opened the door. I want to return to it now and tell you the rest. The part that came after Carol walked in. The part that unfolded in my kitchen over the next 2 hours. The part that began with a laptop and a recording, and Richard's voice, steady and deliberate, coming out of the speaker of my sister's computer in the kitchen of the house where he had lived and laughed and loved for 28 years. But I am getting ahead of myself again. I need to back up just slightly, to tell you what happened in the days before, to tell you what Brandon and Melissa had actually been doing in the 4 days between the funeral and my birthday, because you need to know this in order to understand the full scope of what was revealed that evening. I found out later, from James Whittaker and from Carol, who had been making calls and asking questions, and from certain documents that would eventually come to light through legal processes I'll describe in a moment. Brandon had contacted James Whittaker's office on Tuesday, the day after the funeral. While I was still barely functional, while the house still smelled of the food people had brought, and the flowers were still fresh on the hall table, he had identified himself as Richard Caldwell's son and asked to schedule an urgent meeting regarding the estate. James's assistant had taken the message and relayed it to James, who had noted it and had not called Brandon back because James had been given very specific instructions by Richard about exactly this scenario. Brandon had also contacted, and this is the part that required considerably more research to uncover, a second attorney, a man named Dennis Farlow, a probate attorney who ran a small firm in Oak Brook and who specialized, according to his website, in estate disputes and will contests. Brandon had a meeting with Farlow on Wednesday morning, 2 days after his father's funeral. Melissa had been coordinating with Brandon throughout. She had drafted, and we know this because of the email chain that eventually surfaced in Discovery, a document that she was calling, in her messages to Brandon, the inventory, a list of what she believed to be Richard's assets, the house, the investment accounts, the business, Richard's life insurance policies, his retirement accounts, the cars, the furniture. She had estimated values next to each item. She had done this on the Tuesday after the funeral, the inventory, on Tuesday, with Richard not yet 24 hours in the ground. On Thursday, the day I had not heard from either of them, the day I had floated through the house in my controlled shock, Brandon had met again with Farlow. According to what James Whittaker later told me, Farlow had advised Brandon that his position would be significantly stronger if he moved quickly, if he could establish himself as an active participant in the estate process before I had secured independent legal counsel. Farlow had suggested that Brandon and Melissa present themselves as cooperative and helpful, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for a challenge. On Friday, on my birthday, On the day I sat alone in my house and the phone did not ring, Brandon and Melissa had been preparing those papers, the inventory documents in that manila folder, a proposed agreement for the expedited division of assets that they intended to present to me that evening, while I was alone and grieving and exhausted and they believed vulnerable. They had not called to say happy birthday, not because they forgot, because they had decided, consciously, deliberately, that my birthday was not relevant. What was relevant was the meeting they had planned for 7 o'clock. What was relevant was the papers in the folder. When I opened the door and saw them standing there, I understand now what I was actually looking at. I was looking at my children as they actually were, as they had perhaps always been, or had become, or had allowed themselves to become, stripped of every performance and pretense, every holiday warmth and weekly call, every strategic demonstration of love and affection, stripped down to what they actually wanted and what they were prepared to do to get it. I was looking at two people who had calculated the optimal moment to approach their grieving mother about her money, who had chosen her birthday, 5 days after her husband's funeral, as the correct moment, and who had decided that the birthday itself was simply irrelevant data. "Mom," Brandon said, "we need to talk." And then Carol came through the kitchen door. "I need to tell you about the envelope. I need to tell you about what Richard left for me." 3 days before he died, on a Friday in the early afternoon, when I had gone to the pharmacy to pick up his medications and Carol was sitting with him, Richard had asked Carol for help. He asked her to reach into the second drawer of his bedside table and bring him the sealed envelope that was in the back of it, under the spare reading glasses and the extra phone charger. She brought it to him. He held it for a long moment. Then he said, "When I'm gone, don't give this to Stella right away. Give her a few days. Let her breathe. But don't let it go too long. Watch how the kids behave. And then when the time is right, and you'll know when that is, bring her to the office and let her find it herself." Carol had listened to all of this. She had taken the envelope and put it in her bag, and she had not said anything about it to me, because Richard had asked her not to, and Carol, who has always been better than me at trusting the people she loves, honored that completely. On Thursday night, while I was lying in the too large bed and staring at the ceiling, and Carol was home, making those phone calls I didn't understand. She had gone back to Richard's home office. She had let herself in with the spare key she had always had, the one that lived on her keychain next to her own house key, and she had placed the envelope on Richard's desk in the center, where I would find it, on Friday morning, on my birthday, before I made my coffee, before I sat down at the kitchen table. I had gone to Richard's office. I don't know why exactly. I go there sometimes in the mornings, just to be in the space that was his, to sit in his chair for a few minutes and feel close to him. It is a habit I developed in the weeks of his illness, when he spent most of his time downstairs and I would come up to his office in the early morning and just sit. On Friday morning, on my birthday, I went to the office and sat in his chair, and I saw the envelope on the desk. My name was on it, just Stella, in Richard's handwriting, the particular slant of his capital S that I would know anywhere. I sat with it in my hands for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten on 4 pages of the legal pad paper he always used, and a small flash drive, the kind that looks like a USB stick, white, with a piece of masking tape on which Richard had written one word, play. I want to read you parts of the letter because it is important that you understand what Richard said, and how he said it, and what it reveals about who he was. He started by telling me he loved me. He said it simply, in the first line. "Stella, I love you. and I am sorry I am leaving this for you to deal with." And I had to put the letter down for a moment because the handwriting was so present, so much like his voice, that reading it was almost more than I could manage. He said he had been watching Brandon and Melissa for several years. He said he believed that what motivated their increasing contact and attention in the years of his illness was not love, or not only love, not the whole truth, but a calculation about inheritance, about what they stood to receive, about how to maximize their position. He said he could be wrong, and he asked me to consider carefully before accepting his reading of things, but that in his assessment of people, the assessment he had refined over 30 years in the risk business, he believed he was right. He said he had met with James Whittaker 4 times in the months before his death, and that they had restructured his estate plan in ways designed to protect me. He said that what he had built for me, for our life together, and that it was mine, not as a portion of a divided estate, but entirely, and that he had made sure the law reflected that. He said he had recorded a video, that the video was on the flash drive, that he had recorded it specifically because he anticipated that Brandon and Melissa might attempt to contest the will or challenge the estate, and that the video was a statement of his intentions and his reasons, made of his own clear-minded volition, that James Whittaker had witnessed and notarized, and that would serve as irrefutable evidence of his state of mind. He said, "If Carol is reading this over your shoulder right now, hi, Carol. Thank you. I knew I could count on you." He said, "Stella, you were the answer to something, every day for 32 years. Don't let anyone take what we built." I sat in his chair and held the letter and cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry since he died. Not the controlled, managed grief of the funeral and the days after, but something raw and complete and enormous, the full weight of everything at once. And when I was finished, when I had cried everything that needed to come out right then, I picked up my phone and called Carol. She answered on the first ring. She said, "You found it." "He knew," I said. "He knew everything. He knew," she said. "What do you need?" What I needed was for Carol to come over. What I needed was for us to watch the video together, which we did, sitting side by side in Richard's office chair that afternoon. His voice coming out of the laptop speaker steady and clear, speaking directly to the camera with the particular calm he brought to everything. And I will tell you now that watching your late husband speak to you from a screen, knowing he recorded this, knowing he would be dead when you watched it, is one of the most extraordinary and devastating experiences I have ever had. He looked tired in the video, but entirely himself. He spoke clearly about his intentions. He stated specifically and on the record that he was of sound mind, that he had made these arrangements deliberately and freely, that he wished everything he had built to go to his wife Stella, and that he had done this not in anger but in the clear-eyed understanding that it was the right thing to do. He said near the end of the video, "To my children, I hope I'm wrong. I hope you prove me wrong. I hope that when this moment comes, and I believe it will come, you choose to be the people I wanted you to be. But if you don't, then you should know that your mother is protected, completely. I made sure of it." Carol and I watched the video twice. Then I called James Whittaker. James was expecting my call. He had been waiting for it, he said. He said the estate plan was structured very specifically, that Richard had, with great care, and with full legal support, made provisions that were essentially bulletproof. That was the word James used, and I remember it precisely. Bulletproof, against exactly the kind of challenge that Brandon appeared to be preparing. That the video was part of that, and the restructured accounts and several other elements he would walk me through in detail, and that my position was as strong as it could possibly be. I asked him if he knew about Brandon's contact with Dennis Farlow. There was a brief pause. "Yes," James said. "We expected that too." We. He said we. He and Richard. They had expected it. "What do I do?" I asked. "Nothing yet," James said. "We wait. We let them come to you. And when they do, Carol will be there. And she'll have the video. And we'll let them see exactly what they're up against before they've committed to anything they can't walk back from." I sat with that plan in my chest for the rest of Friday. I cooked myself a birthday dinner. Pasta with olive oil and garlic, Richard's recipe, because it was my birthday, and I was going to observe it even if no one else did. And I poured a glass of wine and I sat at the kitchen table, and I said, out loud, to the empty chair, "Happy birthday to me." And then I said, quieter, "I've got this, Richard. I've got it." At 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Carol came through the kitchen door with her laptop, and the file was open. And when she said, "He was right about everything," Brandon and Melissa both went very still. "What is this?" Brandon said. His voice was careful, measuring, the voice he used when he was calculating. "Carol, what are you doing here?" "I'm here because Stella asked me to be," Carol said. She set the laptop on the kitchen table, the screen facing both of them. "And because your father asked me to be here too, in a way." "Sit down, Brandon." "We're not here to—" "Sit down." Carol's voice was not loud, but it had an absolute quality to it that stopped him mid-sentence. This is something Carol has always had. A certain stillness that when she chooses to use it makes it extremely clear that the conversation is going to happen on her terms. Brandon sat. After a moment, Melissa sat too. She had said almost nothing since arriving. She had been watching me in a way I couldn't quite read, a way that seemed to be recalibrating in real time, the way a computer adjusts to new information. "Mom," Melissa said, "we brought some documents we wanted to go over with you. About the estate. We just want to be helpful." "I know what you brought," I said. "I know about the inventory. I know about Dennis Farlow." The silence that fell over the kitchen then was complete and total. Brandon's expression shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly, the careful management dropping for just a second before reasserting itself. Melissa's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, moved to her lap. "How do you—" Brandon started. "Because your father was a great deal smarter than you gave him credit for," I said. "And because he loved me enough to make sure I would be okay. And because everything you've been doing since Monday, starting with your call to James Whittaker on Tuesday morning and ending with whatever is in that folder, your father anticipated all of it." "Mom, I want you to watch something first," Carol said. She turned the laptop so the screen was fully visible to both of them. "Before we talk about anything, I want you to watch this." She clicked play. Richard's face filled the screen. Melissa made a sound, a small, involuntary sound, the kind of sound you can't prepare for when you see someone you love who is no longer alive, even when you knew it was coming, even when you thought you were prepared. She covered her mouth with her hand. Brandon went absolutely still. Richard's voice came through the speaker, calm and clear and entirely present. He said, "If you are watching this, it means I was right. I'm sorry to be right. I want you to know that. I spent a long time hoping I was wrong." He spoke for 11 minutes. I know because Carol had told me when we watched it together, and I had watched the timer in the corner of the screen. 11 minutes of Richard, tired but clear, deliberate but not angry, explaining what he had done and why. He talked about what he had observed over the years. He talked about the choices he had seen his children making. He talked about what he owed to the woman he had built everything with, and the responsibility he felt to protect her. He talked, near the end, about what he had hoped for his family and what he had come to understand, and his voice did not waver once. When the video ended, the kitchen was completely silent. Brandon was the first to speak. "This doesn't change anything legally," he said. His voice was tight. "A video statement isn't—" "I know what a video statement is," I said. "I've spoken with James Whittaker, at length. This is actually the least of what your father arranged." "Mom," Melissa said. Her voice had changed entirely. The professional composure was gone, and what was left was something younger and more frightened. And if I am honest, some part of me felt the pull of that, the familiar pull of my daughter needing comfort, and I breathed through it and stayed where I was. "Mom, we weren't trying to—" "Melissa," I said her name quietly. "I have the emails. I have the drafts of the inventory you made on Tuesday. I know about Farlow. I know what you were planning and how long you had been planning it. And I know that today, on my birthday, 5 days after your father's funeral, you came here not to see me, but to push me toward a legal situation you thought I was too devastated to resist." She looked down at the table. "I want to tell you something," I said. "Both of you. And I want you to hear it the way your father said things when he needed them to be heard, which is without anger and without drama and with complete clarity." I waited until they were both looking at me. "Your father restructured everything 18 months ago. The accounts are structured in ways that reflect his wishes entirely. The house is mine. The business, what James is going to do with the business, because your father and James discussed this at length, is going to be handled in a way that I approve, and that you have no legal standing to contest, because the estate plan is airtight, and the video you just watched is witnessed and notarized and is simply one part of a very thorough documentation of your father's intentions and state of mind. Dennis Farlow can take this to court if he likes. James Whittaker has 30 years of experience and a file prepared for exactly that scenario." The silence stretched out. "You are my children," I said. "I have not stopped loving you. I am not capable of stopping loving you, because that is apparently how I am built, and I have made my peace with it. But what you have done, what you have been doing, is something that is going to have consequences, and not primarily legal ones. The legal situation is clear. What I am talking about is what happens between us going forward, which is something only you can determine." Brandon opened his mouth, closed it. I said, "You should leave now, and you should both spend some serious time thinking about who you want to be, because your father made his choices, and his choices are going to stand. What you decide now is what you're going to have to live with." They left. Brandon carried the manila folder. He had not opened it once. Carol and I sat in the kitchen after they were gone, and we drank tea and we talked for a long time. About Richard, about what he had known and what he had done about it, about what came next, about what I wanted the next part of my life to look like. Outside, the October dark had settled over the backyard, and the maple trees were invisible now, just presences in the dark. But I knew they were there. Brandon had planted them when he was 6. I had been there. I remembered. I am going to tell you now what happened in the months that followed, because I want this story to be complete, because I think you deserve to know how it ended. James Whittaker filed the estate paperwork in November. Brandon had, in fact, engaged Farlow to contest certain provisions. But Farlow's approach, which had apparently been premised on a version of Richard's estate that did not match the actual, restructured version, ran into the reality of what Richard had prepared fairly quickly. After 2 months of legal correspondence, during which I was largely shielded from the details by James and by the structure Richard had put in place, Brandon and Farlow withdrew. The estate was settled in January. Everything Richard had arranged stood exactly as he had intended. Caldwell Risk Solutions was handled exactly as Richard had wished. He had made arrangements with his business partner, a man named Gary Hendricks, who had been with the company for 12 years, for a buyout structure that gave Gary operational control while providing Stella with an ongoing return from the business Richard had spent 20 years building. Gary, it turned out, had known about Richard's plans and had been deeply involved in ensuring they were executable. He called me in January to tell me that taking care of the people Richard loved had always been important to Richard, and that it was important to him too. I want to tell you about Brandon and Melissa now, because I know you're wondering. Melissa called me in December. She did not call to discuss legal matters. She called at 11 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, and when I answered, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I'm sorry." She said it simply, without preamble or justification, just those 3 words, and I could hear in her voice that she meant them, or was at least trying to, or was at some beginning of understanding what needed to be understood. We talked for an hour. It was not easy, and it was not resolved, and it was not a restoration, but it was a beginning, and I received it as one, because I am my mother's daughter, and my mother always believed in the possibility of people choosing better. Brandon has not called. I do not know what will happen with Brandon. I know that grief does strange things to people, and I know that greed does stranger things still, and I know that whatever was built in my son that led to those choices in October is not something that changes quickly, or easily, or perhaps at all. I hold open a door for him, in my heart, in the way I have always held open doors for the people I love. Whether he walks through it is his to decide. Carol and I have lunch every Tuesday. She comes to the house and we cook something together and we eat at the kitchen table. Not at Richard's chair. I still don't sit in Richard's chair, but I have not moved it either because it belongs there. Because he sat there for 30 years, and the shape of that belongs in this room. And we talk, and sometimes we laugh, and sometimes we sit in comfortable quiet, and it is more than enough. I walk in the evenings now. It was something Richard's cardiologist told him to do, and something Richard actually did those last years. And I found myself starting to do it after he died, almost without deciding to. The way you adopt the habits of people you love after they are gone. I walk through the neighborhood in the early evening, past the elementary school and the maple trees, and the houses where people are beginning to turn on lights against the dark. And I think about Richard, and I think about everything he did to protect me, and I think about the extraordinary care of a man who was dying, and still spent some of his remaining time and energy building a wall between the people he loved and the ones who would take from them. That is what love looks like, when it is doing something more than feeling, when it is acting, when it is a form of protection and provision and forethought that outlasts the person doing the loving. Richard was right about everything. He was almost always right about things, which was one of the qualities that drove me crazy sometimes, and that I miss with an intensity that still occasionally catches me off guard. Driving, or at the grocery store, or making pasta with garlic and olive oil on a Friday evening. He left me a chipped coffee mug and an empty chair and a 4-bedroom house full of his presents, and an estate plan that was, in James Whittaker's word, bulletproof, and a video on a flash drive in which he looked directly into the camera and said everything that needed to be said, and the knowledge, which I carry now every day, that being loved by someone is sometimes the thing that saves you from the people who stopped loving you long before they showed it. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, I want you to know something. You are the reason I keep sharing these things. Your presence here, the fact that you are listening, the fact that you believe that stories like this deserve to be told. It means everything to me. Please hit that like button if this story moved you. Please share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is going through something hard, someone who needs to know that preparation and love and the foresight of someone who cared deeply can make all the difference. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I have more stories to tell, and I am not done yet. And if you have been through something like this, if you have been betrayed by the people you trusted, if you have been surprised by who showed up for you when it mattered and who didn't, leave it in the comments. I read every single one. You are not alone. Richard knew. He knew everything, and he made sure. That's the whole story.